There are nights when you close your eyes, but your mind refuses to sleep. Thoughts circle back on themselves, unnamed questions drift through you, and a vague sense of emptiness lingers, something you cannot quite put into words. You are tired, yet deep inside, a part of you is still searching for meaning, for peace, for yourself. Carl Gustav Jung once pointed out that when we don't listen to the unconscious, it speaks through unease, and perhaps the fact that you are here, within this video, is not sluchai. Philosophy concepts to fall asleep. Taboo is not meant to teach you philosophy. It was created to guide you beneath thought, to touch the deepest layers of the mind, where the soul begins to rest. Here, you will not be forced to understand everything. You only need to listen. Philosophical ideas, from illusion, the ego, and freedom, to wholeness, will open like gentle doors, leading you away from the noise of the outside world and back into the quiet space within. If you are feeling lost, if you carry too many questions with you into sleep each night, this video does not promise you answers, but it offers you a place where the mind can let go. Let awareness slow down, and let this journey carry you into sleep, not as an escape, but as a return. Human beings begin their journey of living not with truth, but with images of truth. We believe what our eyes see, what our ears hear, the way the world appears before us, and we call that reality. But as Carl Gustav Jung quietly pointed out, human consciousness is never neutral at the beginning. It is shaped by fear, by the need to feel safe, and by unconscious patterns that exist even before we learn to ask questions. At this first level, we do not live in the world as it truly is. We live in a version of it that the mind has simplified, softened, and shielded for us. Shadows do not appear because human beings are ignorant. They appear because a young mind is not yet strong enough to endure the full light of truth. In order to survive, it learns to see the world through familiar forms. Right and wrong, safe and dangerous, accepted and rejected. These images are not false, but they are not whole, and when we cling to them for too long, we begin to confuse them. We come to believe that what we see is the very essence of things. Jung called this a state in which consciousness has not yet learned to doubt itself. When we have never turned around, we do not know that there is a source of light behind us, and that it is this very light that creates the shadow. Unconsciously, we live as if the world is happening to us, without realizing that the world is being experienced through us. At this level, the soul sleeps very deeply, not because it is weak, but because it has not yet been called awake. There is a strange sense of peace in living among shadows. No choosing, no responsibility, no questioning. When everything is already named, the mind can rest, but the price is that truth is postponed. Jung once warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. At this first level, fate is believed to come from the outside. We do not yet know that it is the unilluminated images within the unconscious that are quietly guiding us, through our relationships, through our fears, through the way we see ourselves. The first shadows are also where the persona begins to form, the social mask that helps us adapt, be accepted, and be loved. We learn how to become right according to the world, before we ever ask whether that world is truly right for our soul. But Jung did not see this as a mistake. He saw it as a necessary stage. Without an original darkness, consciousness would never learn how to seek the light. The danger only begins when a person falls asleep inside the shadow. When we completely identify with our image of ourselves, with roles, identities, and borrowed beliefs, we begin to live a life that is right, but not true. And deep inside, the soul begins to whisper, At first, very softly, a sense of emptiness, a sadness with no clear cause, a fatigue that cannot be explained. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs that consciousness is ready for a deeper level. Jung once wrote a line that is very quiet, yet very powerful. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. But in this chapter 1, we do not yet need the light. We only need to admit that we are seeing shadows, that the world we believe is everything may only be the front face of something deeper. There is no need to rush into awakening, no need to shatter the sleep, only a small softening, a moment to recognize that truth is not the opposite of safety, but that truth is waiting for us to become strong enough to meet it. And if, as you listen to these words now, your eyelids begin to grow heavy, that is not escape. It is the soul returning to its most original state, where darkness is not driven away, but allowed to exist. For only when it is accepted can the shadow begin to grow thin. At this first level, there is no demand to understand. There is only a very soft whisper. Sleep peacefully in the darkness until the darkness itself calls you awake. When we begin to realize that what we see are only shadows, a very subtle movement occurs in the mind. The shadows lose their power to lull us to sleep, and consciousness, for the first time, turns back to look at itself. In that moment, the ego begins to form. The I that we protect, cherish, and fear losing appears to be something solid and continuous. We say, I am this kind of person. I have always been this way. I cannot change. But if we look more deeply, as Carl Jung invited us to do, we discover that the ego is not an unchanging entity, but a process in motion. It does not is, it is becoming. The metaphor of a ship repaired over the years touches a deep human anxiety. Each piece of wood that is replaced is a fading memory, a collapsed belief, a role that no longer fits. We are no longer the child who once believed in the world with innocence. We are no longer the person who once dreamed with simple hope. And sometimes, when we look back, we ask ourselves, if everything in me has changed, then what remains that I can still call me? Jung believed that the ego is not the center of the whole soul, but it is the center of consciousness, the place where we experience ourselves as a separate individual. The problem arises when the ego confuses its role. It begins to believe, I am the whole of who I am. And from that moment, every change becomes a threat. But the truth is different. Change does not destroy the ego. It reveals its inherent fragility. When a belief collapses, we do not suffer because we lost the belief itself, but because we lost the sense of stability it once gave us. When a role no longer fits, we do not feel lost because the role was wrong, but because we identified with it for too long. Jung once wrote, "The ego is not master in its own house." This line is not meant to make human beings despair, but to free us from the illusion of control. The ego does not create the whole person. It only perceives a very small part of the life of the soul. And when the ego begins to realize this, a question arises. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply enough to shake the foundations. Who am I, beyond what I have thought myself to be? This moment often comes with crisis. People call it being lost, a midlife crisis, a feeling of not being myself anymore. But from Jung's perspective, this is not failure. It is a sign of psychological growth. The ego, after a long time of living through borrowed definitions, begins to feel that they are no longer large enough to contain it. And it is precisely here that fear appears. For if the I is not fixed, then what guarantees that I will not dissolve? Jung understood this fear very well. He did not advise people to destroy the ego, but to place it in its proper position. The ego is the navigator, not the ship, the storyteller, not the whole story. He wrote, "Man needs difficulties. They are necessary for health." The discomfort of the ego being shaken is not a sign that we are going the wrong way. It is a sign that we are going deeper. For only when the I is no longer certain does a person begin to open to a wider dimension of themselves, what Jung called the self, the center of wholeness of the soul. In this chapter 2, we have not yet touched the self. We are only standing at the edge of the question, but that very question is already enough to change the way we listen to our inner life. We begin to realize that constantly repairing the ship does not mean the ship is false. It only means that life itself is always in motion. And the mind's insistence on still calling it me is not a mistake. It is the ego's desperate attempt to preserve a sense of continuity in a world that never stops changing. If, as you listen to these words now, you feel a very light sadness without knowing exactly why, let it be there. That sadness is not because you are losing yourself. It is because you are beginning to no longer fully identify with what is old, and that is a necessary step. Jung once reminded us, what you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. The more the ego resists change, the more it suffers. But when we allow ourselves to admit that the I is in motion, a softening occurs. There is no need to know the answer right away. No need to define yourself in a new shape. Only allow the question, who am I, to remain, like a small lamp, bright enough to keep you from getting lost, yet gentle enough to let you keep walking. And when night falls, when consciousness grows tired of holding on to an image of itself, sleep arrives like a reminder. You do not need to be fixed in order to exist. The ship can continue to be repaired. The river keeps flowing, and somewhere deeper than the ego, a part of you remains whole, quietly watching, waiting for the moment when you are ready to meet it. Chapter 2 ends not with a definition, but with a gentle release. Because sometimes, sleeping peacefully in the midst of change is the deepest way for the soul to prepare for the next level of awareness. And when the ego begins to realize that it is no longer immutable, that the I is only a form in motion, a new confusion quietly emerges. And in that hazy space, for the first time, a human being begins to feel the weight of choice. In Chapter 3, we enter the territory of decision and responsibility, where the illusion of absolute self-mastery begins to crack. Human beings often believe that they choose through reason, weighing right and wrong, benefit and harm, morality and immorality. But Carl Gustav Jung sought a deeper and far more unsettling truth. Reason rarely leads. It usually arrives last, like a skillful advocate for decisions that were made at a deeper level. When we face a moral situation, it is not only thought that appears. An entire invisible procession enters with it. Survival instincts, childhood memories, the fear of rejection, the images of parents and ancestors, and the patterns passed down through generations. Jung called these the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, the silent currents that shape our reactions before we have time to name them. We often reassure ourselves, I have thought this through carefully. But Jung was more direct. He wrote, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. To face one's own soul, to face the real motives behind a choice, is always harder than constructing a reasonable explanation, and so morality is often misunderstood as a system of external rules, rather than an inner conflict that must be looked at honestly. At this level, a deeply unsettling realization begins to surface. We do not fully command our own decisions. There are moments when we react before we think. Moments when we know what is right, yet do something else. Not because we are evil, but because within us exist parts that have not yet been reconciled. Jung called these parts the shadow, the psychological shadow that holds the desires, fears, and impulses the ego does not want to acknowledge. Morality, in Jung's view, is not born from blind obedience to norms. It is born from an honest dialogue with the shadow. When we deny it, it acts in the dark. When we recognize it, we begin to have real choice. Jung warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." In this context, fate often becomes a way to escape responsibility. We say, "I had no other choice. I had to be this way." But Jung did not see responsibility as a moral burden. He saw it as the natural consequence of awareness. When we do not see the unconscious forces, we are ruled by them. When we begin to see them, we are no longer innocent, and we cannot go back. What makes Chapter 3 heavy is not the act of choosing, but the awareness of choice. Once we realize that we could have acted differently, we must also face guilt, regret, and ambiguity. But Jung did not see these feelings as mistakes. They are signs that a person is leaving borrowed morality and stepping into personal morality. He once wrote, with great subtlety, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." Every moral choice is such a reaction. We do not leave it unchanged. Whatever we choose, we are transformed. And for this reason, responsibility does not lie in achieving a perfect outcome, but in the degree of honesty we have toward the motives within us. At this level, people often grow tired, because it is easy to simply do what is right. But it is hard to ask, who in me wants this? Is it the fear of being abandoned, the hunger for recognition, or a deeper value trying to rise to the surface? Jung believed that only when we dare to ask such questions does morality become something living, rather than a slogan. If, as you listen now, you feel your heartbeat slow, your breath deepen, and a quiet spread within you, this is not confusion. It is the moment when the soul is weighing, not between right and wrong, but between the unconscious and the conscious. Not every conflict needs to be resolved immediately. Some conflicts need to be carried for a while, long enough to teach us something about ourselves. Chapter 3 does not end with a right choice. It ends with a very quiet whisper. You are only truly responsible when you dare to look at the forces that led you to that decision. And when night falls, when the mind grows tired of trying to be good, sleep arrives as a gentle pause, where the unconscious continues its work, silently preparing the next level of understanding. And when a person begins to look directly at the unconscious forces that have guided their choices, a deeper and heavier question immediately arises. If we are not completely free in our decisions, then where does true freedom actually reside? In Chapter 4, we enter the central paradox of human life. We both believe ourselves to be free, and yet feel guided. We wake each day with the sense that we are choosing our path, choosing our relationships, choosing how to live, and at the same time, we carry a vague feeling that something has already been arranged, as if we are walking along a familiar road, even though we cannot remember when we first stepped onto it. Carl Gustav Jung did not deny free will, but he rejected the idea of a naive freedom, the kind of freedom that believes human beings stand entirely independent of their own psychological history. Jung saw the human being as a point of convergence for countless causes: biology, memory, family, culture, and ancient patterns passed down through the collective unconscious. When we do not recognize these causes, we call our experience fate. When we begin to see them, we begin to touch responsibility. There is great comfort in believing that everything is already determined. If life is only the result of circumstances, we do not have to take responsibility for our sadness, for our repeating relationships, for our familiar mistakes. But Jung understood that this comfort comes at a high price, the postponement of growth. He wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." This sentence does not deny the past. It simply places the past where it belongs, as an origin, not as a verdict. Jung did not believe that human beings can escape causes. He believed they can become conscious of them. And it is precisely this consciousness that becomes the deepest form of freedom available to us. Freedom, in Jung's view, is not the ability to act without constraint. It is the ability to recognize what is constraining us. When we do not see the strings, we are pulled by them unconsciously. When we see them, we can choose to continue, to pause, or to walk more slowly. Not every string can be cut, but seeing them is enough to change the way we walk. Jung once warned, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble." Freedom and fate are among such problems. They are not resolved by choosing one side. They must be held together in a living paradox. Human beings are both products of the past and participants in their own future. When we try to deny either side, the psyche begins to fracture. At this level, many people feel uneasy, because if freedom is not absolute, there is nowhere left to hide. We cannot place all blame on circumstances, but we also cannot punish ourselves with cruelty. Jung did not call on people to become harder. He called on them to become more honest with the structure of their own souls. The invisible causes whisper behind every decision, not to manipulate, but to be recognized. When a reaction repeats, when a pattern of relationship returns, when a fear refuses to leave, this is not weakness. It is an invitation from the unconscious. Jung wrote, "Whom we meet again and again in life are surely characters of our own drama. We do not encounter the same problem because we are cursed. We encounter it because we have not yet seen our own part in it. And when we begin to see, fate loses its mysterious aura. It becomes a psychological structure that can be observed, even if it cannot always be changed immediately." Freedom, therefore, is not a dramatic moment of release. It is a slow process of recognition. Each time we notice an unconscious reaction, a hidden motive, an ancient fear, we do not escape it, but we are no longer completely identified with it. And that very small distance is enough for the soul to breathe. Jung once said something that sounds simple, yet carries great weight. Freedom is not arbitrary choice, but the capacity to act consciously. In Chapter 4, we learn to see freedom in a new way, not as a privilege, but as a responsibility of awareness. We are not responsible for everything that is formed within us, but we are responsible for whether we are willing to look at it. And when night falls, when the mind grows tired of trying to control life, a gentle truth appears. You do not need to be completely free in order to be at peace. You only need to be conscious enough not to keep being carried along in unawareness. Sleep does not arrive as surrender, but as a pause, where consciousness loosens its grip and the unconscious continues its work, quietly rearranging the inner threads. Chapter 4 closes not with an answer, but with a very soft feeling. Freedom does not lie in not being guided, but in knowing what is guiding you. And when a person begins to realize that freedom does not lie in escaping causes, but in becoming conscious of them, a silent space opens. And within that space, existential anxiety begins to speak. Chapter 5 does not open with an answer, but with silence. A silence that frightens many people. For from childhood, Human beings live surrounded by ready-made meanings. Who they must become, what they must live for, what they must believe in, so that their lives feel valuable. But when those structures begin to collapse, when the ego grows tired of holding its shape, when freedom is no longer a sweet illusion, the mind falls into a strange emptiness. No more answers. No more guidance. No more voices assuring that everything will be okay. The universe remains silent before the question, why do I exist? And it is this silence that makes human beings tremble. But Carl Gustav Jung did not see this anxiety as pathological. On the contrary, he saw it as a sign of deep transformation. Jung understood that only when borrowed meanings no longer have the strength to sustain us does the soul begin to speak in its own voice. He wrote, with striking directness, "Meaninglessness inhibits fullness of life and is therefore equivalent to illness." At first glance, this sentence can sound harsh, but Jung was not saying that emptiness itself is an illness. He was saying that living indefinitely within emptiness without listening to it is what becomes illness. Existential anxiety is not a deviation. It is a signal that the mind has reached the edge of its old structures and cannot return without betraying itself. At this level, many people try to fill the void as quickly as possible, with work, with relationships, with new beliefs, or with positive affirmations. But Jung warned that rushing to escape anxiety only causes it to return in other forms, deeper, more persistent. Because this anxiety does not come from the outside. It comes from a rupture between the ego and the deeper dimension of the soul. Jung once wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." Existential anxiety is the moment when the ego can no longer look outward to dream. It is forced to turn inward, not by choice, but because it has no other option. And what it encounters there is not a clear answer, but a vast, ambiguous, unformed space. A space where questions last longer than answers. What makes existential anxiety so heavy is that it cannot be resolved by reason. It does not ask what we should do. It asks who we are when there is no longer a reason to exist. And that is a question the ego cannot answer alone. Jung believed this is the moment when the self, the whole integrative center of the psyche, begins to knock on the door of consciousness. But before that door opens, a person must pass through the night, a night without stars to guide the way. Jung called this a necessary phase of the individuation process, where the old has died, but the new has not yet been born. He once wrote, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." Anxiety is that root touching the depths. It hurts because it pulls the person away from the familiar surface of life. But if we don't cut it away, if we don't rush to make it disappear, this anxiety slowly becomes a womb-like space. A place where values are no longer received from the outside, but begin to be born from lived experience. In Chapter 5, Jung does not advise people to search immediately for meaning. He advises them to stay long enough with meaninglessness, to listen for what is trying to be born. Because true meaning never appears as a slogan. It appears as a deep, quiet sense that this is worth continuing to live for, even if I cannot fully explain why. If at this moment, as you listen to these words, you feel a gentle emptiness spreading, do not rush to be afraid. This is not a sign that you have lost your way. It is a sign that you are no longer walking on a pre-drawn path, and Jung believed that only there does a person have the chance to live a life with depth. Chapter 5 closes not with a loud hope, but with a very quiet trust. Anxiety does not come to destroy you. It comes to awaken the deepest part of you, the part that cannot live on borrowed meanings. And when night falls, when the question why no longer demands an immediate answer, Sleep arrives as a permission for the soul to continue its work in silence, where sometimes meaning takes shape without words. And when existential anxiety has stayed long enough, when the silence of the universe no longer causes panic, but only echoes, another door opens. A door leading straight into the land that human beings often call nothingness. Chapter 6 begins at the moment when old values no longer hold. The things that once supported us, beliefs, ideals, roles, goals, suddenly feel empty or no longer convincing. This is a dangerous moment, but also a decisive one. For when all borrowed meanings collapse, a person truly stands before two paths: surrender or creation. Nothingness is often misunderstood as absolute emptiness, as a cold void where there is nothing to hold on to. But Carl Jung saw nothingness through a different lens. He did not view it as an ending, but as a transitional space that has not yet been properly named. Nothingness is not the absence of meaning, it is the absence of old meanings, making room for something more authentic to take shape. Jung once wrote a short but weighty sentence: "Man cannot stand a meaningless life. Human beings cannot live long in nothingness." But that doesn't mean nothingness is wrong. It only means that nothingness is a phase, not a place of residence. When a person tries to turn it into a final resting point, it becomes despair. But when a person walks through it like an unplanted field, it becomes possibility. At this level, many people mistakenly believe the solution is to return to old values, as if simply believing again, clinging again, will make everything right. But Jung understood that once consciousness has passed through existential anxiety, it cannot return to its original innocence. Values that were once accepted without question now lose their psychological authority. And forcing oneself to believe again only creates a deeper split within the soul. Nothingness, therefore, makes a very quiet but very strict demand. If no meaning is given anymore, what will you do? Not what should you believe, but what will you create to live with? Jung did not encourage people to invent meaning arbitrarily. He did not advocate making up a reason to live as a mental strategy. He believed that true meaning is not created by willpower, but discovered through a deep relationship with the unconscious. He wrote, "The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it." Meaning does not need to be grand. It only needs to be true to the soul. In Chapter 6, the soul begins to learn a new skill, no longer waiting to be given value from the outside, but listening for what within is asking to be lived. This is a slow, unclear process, often accompanied by a sense of loneliness, for there is no longer any system that guarantees you are on the right path. Yet it is precisely within this lack of guarantee that a person first has the chance to live a life that is not imposed. Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." The pain of nothingness does not lie in having no meaning, but in having to take responsibility for your own meaning. There is no one left to blame, no one left to ask permission from, and no one left to guarantee that your choice is correct. But Jung believed that only then do values truly take root. Nothingness is like a field that has been plowed down to its deepest layer. On the surface, it looks barren, but precisely because it has been turned over, it now has the capacity to receive new seeds. The values that grow here are not universal. They are deeply individualized. What is meaningful to you may be completely meaningless to someone else. And Jung believed this is not only normal, but necessary. For the process of individuation is not meant to create a correct person, but a whole person. And wholeness does not mean being accepted by society. It means that the parts of the soul no longer have to pretend in order to exist. If at this moment, as you listen to these words, you feel a very different kind of emptiness, not panic, but something like an opening, stay with it. This is not a sign that you have lost your values. It is a sign that you are in the place where true values can be born. Chapter 6 does not promise easy hope. It does not say that everything will be fine. It only whispers a deeper truth. Nothingness is not the enemy of meaning. It is the condition that allows meaning to no longer be borrowed. And when night falls, when the mind no longer tries to find a reason to exist, sleep arrives as a gentle pause, where unnamed seeds continue to be sown in the dark, not loudly, not with certainty, but enough for the soul, somewhere very deep, to begin to trust that a new value is quietly taking shape. And when old values have dissolved, when meaning is no longer given, but must be listened for from within, the mind naturally makes its next movement. It begins to question not only what it believes, but the very foundation of believing itself. Chapter 7 opens with a cold and cutting question. If the senses can deceive, what is certain? This is no longer existential anxiety, nor is it the void of collapsed values. This is doubt carried all the way down to the roots of reality itself. When human beings lose faith in external systems, they turn inward, but not to seek comfort. They turn inward to ask the final question: is this world real? And am I real? Carl Gustav Jung understood this moment deeply. He did not see it as an intellectual game, but as a psychological state, dangerous, yet necessary. When every external support has fallen away, the mind begins to doubt the senses, memory, thought, even the feeling of I exist. Skepticism and solipsism are no longer philosophical concepts. They become lived experience. At this level, a person often feels as though they are standing on trembling ground. If the eyes can see falsely, the ears can hear incorrectly, and memory can distort, how can we know that anything happening is real? Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." The pain here is not sadness, but the loss of certainty, a radical loss of certainty, where nothing is taken as self-evident. Yet Jung did not believe that doubt leads to complete nothingness. He believed that within extreme skepticism, there remains a core that cannot be denied. That core is, experience is happening. Even if we doubt the world, even if we doubt ourselves, there is one thing that cannot be erased. Something is being experienced right now. Consciousness does not need to prove the world in order to exist. It does not need to guarantee that everything is real in any absolute sense. It only needs to be experiencing. Jung saw consciousness not as a mirror reflecting reality, but as a living jurion, where world and subject meet in every moment. He wrote a profoundly deep line. The world exists not merely in itself, but also as it appears to me. This does not lead to absolute isolation. It leads to a new humility. We no longer claim to know what reality is. We only acknowledge that we are living within an experience of it. And that acknowledgement frees the mind from an impossible task, having to be certain about everything. In Chapter 7, Jung does not encourage people to cling to doubt as an identity. Doubt, when identified with, becomes a wall that separates us from life. But when passed through, it becomes a door into pure presence. There is no longer a need to believe or disbelieve. There is only being. Solipsism, the idea that only one's own consciousness is certain to exist, is often seen as dangerous. But Jung saw in it an important reminder. Experience is always personal, and no one can live your experience for you. This does not make the world disappear. It simply reveals that every contact with the world passes through a mediator, the soul. And when we accept this, a softening occurs. We stop trying to prove reality. We begin to be with it. Jung once wrote, "I do not know what the world is, but I know what I experience." At this level, people often feel alone, for there is no longer a shared truth to hold on to. But Jung believed this is a necessary kind of solitude, the solitude of consciousness standing on its own, not leaning on doctrine, not leaning on guarantees, only leaning on the capacity for direct experience. If at this moment, as you listen, you feel a deep stillness spreading, as if there is nothing more you need to understand, that is not emptiness. It is presence. A place where the question, "Is this real?" becomes less urgent than the question, "How am I living in this moment?" Chapter 7 does not end with an assertion. It ends with a very subtle letting go. Consciousness does not need to prove the world in order to live within it. And when night falls, when the mind grows tired of trying to be certain, sleep arrives as a gentle permission to allow the world to be what it is, and to allow you to simply experience being here. No guarantees, no definitions, only a quiet presence where even doubt can be set down, and consciousness can drift softly into the healing darkness of sleep. And when consciousness stops trying to prove reality, when it accepts staying with the experience that is unfolding, another boundary slowly comes into view, the boundary of language itself. Chapter 8 opens in the place where many people feel the most confused, where words are no longer precise enough to touch what is actually being lived. Human beings are used to believing that if we can define something clearly enough, we can possess it. But Carl Gustav Jung understood that the soul does not operate by the logic of definition. It does not speak in sharp outlines. It speaks in blurred edges, in feelings of almost, not quite, not just enough, too much, a little less. And it is precisely this ambiguity that often unsettles the mind. We grow up in a world that demands clear answers, right or wrong, true or false, enough or not enough. But when consciousness moves deeper into inner life, it begins to encounter experiences that refuse to stay inside the frame of words. We feel both love and fear, both the urge to let go and the urge to hold on, both belief and doubt. These paradoxes are not signs of disorder. Jung saw them as signs of depth. He once wrote, "The paradox is one of the deepest sources of human understanding. Paradox does not arise because thinking has failed, but because reality is deeper than the dividing lines of binary thought. When we try to force living experience into precise definitions, we do not make it clearer, we make it poorer. The soul does not want to be defined. It wants to be listened to." At this level, the mind begins to learn a difficult lesson: letting go of control. For control always needs clarity. It needs to know where it is going, what it is doing, whether it is right or wrong. But the life of the soul does not move along a straight path. It moves through symbols, dreams, images, and vague sensations, things that cannot be measured, only experienced. Jung, more than almost anyone, understood the power of ambiguous language. He did not write to explain the soul, but to evoke it. He believed that some things, when spoken too clearly, lose their vitality. He once said, "The unconscious can make a fool of you in no time." Not to mock human beings, but to remind us that the unconscious does not follow the ego's logic of control. When the ego tries to understand everything through reason alone, it often misses the most important message, the one that can only be felt, not defined. In Chapter 8, a person begins to realize that not every question needs a precise answer. Some questions only need to be held long enough for them to transform. When is it enough? When is it too little? When is it right? These questions have no fixed borders. They change with context, with the person, with the stage of life. And accepting this ambiguity does not make us weaker. It makes us softer and deeper. Jung once wrote a very simple line: "Life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced." Precise language helps us solve problems, but inner life is not a problem. It is a flow, and when we try to turn it into something to be solved, we step outside our own experience. At this level, the mind learns to stay with uncertainty instead of rushing to make it disappear. Many people fear ambiguity because they confuse it with being lost. But Jung understood that being truly lost does not come from having no answers. It comes from not daring to stay with the question. When we allow paradox to exist, when we do not force ourselves to choose a side too quickly, a new inner space opens. There, opposing parts no longer have to destroy each other. They begin to speak to one another. This is an important preparation for a deeper reconciliation. For if the mind does not learn to endure ambiguity, it will always seek false certainty. And every false certainty is paid for with inner division. Jung believed that wholeness does not come from eliminating contradiction, but from containing it. If, as you listen now, you feel a lightness spreading, as if you do not need to understand anything more, that is not giving up. It is a deeper trust in lived experience, a trust that not everything needs to be named. Some things only need to be fully lived. Chapter 8 closes with a very gentle letting go. The soul does not ask you to understand it. It only asks you not to distort it with certainty too soon. And when night falls, when the mind grows tired of trying to define everything, sleep comes as a gentle reward, where paradox is no longer a problem, ambiguity is no longer a threat, and consciousness is allowed to dissolve into a wordless space where sometimes not knowing itself becomes the deepest form of healing. And when the mind has learned to release its need for precise definition, when it accepts that paradox and ambiguity are not enemies, but doors, a deeper question naturally arises. If the soul cannot be grasped by language, then where do we go to find it? Chapter 9 leads us to the fragile boundary between the brain and consciousness, between what can be measured and what can only be lived. Science tells us that the brain functions. Neurons fire, chemicals are released, neural networks constantly reconfigure themselves. But alongside all of these physical movements, experience appears. A feeling of sadness, a memory that suddenly returns, a sense of calm spreading through the chest. There is no machine that can point and say, consciousness is here. Carl Jung did not deny science, but he recognized a very clear limit. Science can describe mechanisms, yet it cannot touch the meaning of experience. He understood that the brain is a necessary condition for consciousness, but not the final answer to the deepest question. Why is there experience at all rather than nothing? Jung once wrote, "Psyche and matter are two different aspects of one and the same thing." For Jung, mind and body are not two separate entities, but two faces of a deeper reality. The brain is active, that is true. But the fact that an experience is happening cannot be reduced to pure biological activity without losing what is most essential about being human. At this level, many people try to find a central stage of consciousness, a point, a brain region, a structure that determines everything. But Jung understood that this very effort reflects the ego's habit of control. We want to know where consciousness is so that we can grasp it, but consciousness does not stay still to be grasped. It spreads, it seeps into the body, emotions, images, dreams, memories, and even into what has never been named. Jung did not ask, "Where is consciousness?" He asked, "What does consciousness want to say?" He saw consciousness not merely as a function, but as a living phenomenon, constantly interacting with the unconscious. And the body, in this view, is not a container for consciousness, but the place where consciousness is expressed. Anxiety does not live only in thought. It lives in the heartbeat, in the shortened breath, in the tension across the shoulders. Peace is not just an idea. It is a very real softening in the body. Jung once wrote a line that startled many. The soul is not a thing, but a relation. Consciousness is not an object located in the brain. It is a relationship in motion, between body and mind, between inside and outside, between the individual and the world. When we try to isolate it to a single point, we lose its living nature. In Chapter 9, science begins to pause, not because it is wrong, but because it has reached the boundary of its method. And at that boundary, reflection begins. Jung believed that there are questions that cannot be answered by measurement, only lived with. Consciousness is one of those questions. He wrote, "There is no knowledge of the psyche without lived experience. We can know a great deal about the brain, but if we do not listen to our own experience, we will never touch the soul. And conversely, if we sink only into experience and deny the body and the material world, we lose our grounding." Jung always emphasized balance, not to sanctify consciousness, and not to reduce it to biological reaction. At this level, a person begins to feel themselves as a whole, no longer just I think, but I feel, I resonate, I am present. Consciousness is no longer a concept to be debated, but a life unfolding in every moment. And precisely when we stop searching for its center, we begin to live with it more deeply. If, as you listen now, you feel your breath becoming clearer, your body heavier, and warmer, that is not drifting away. That is consciousness spreading into the body, instead of being trapped in the head. Jung believed that much modern suffering comes from living too much in thought, and forgetting that consciousness always needs a body to anchor itself. He once reminded us, the body is merely the visibility of the soul, the psychological experience of the body. In Chapter 9, we do not find a final answer to why consciousness exists, but we find a way to stay with the question without panic. We accept that there are things that cannot be fully explained, and that this very incompleteness is what gives human experience its depth. Chapter 9 closes not with a scientific conclusion, but with a very human sense. You do not need to know where consciousness is in order to live within it. And when night falls, when the body is allowed to rest, when thought slows down, consciousness does not disappear. It softens. It spreads like a thin mist, where science no longer needs to go further, and the soul is allowed to whisper through its own quiet presence. And when consciousness has spread beyond the limits of the body, when it no longer searches for a central stage inside the brain, a natural movement occurs. The gaze no longer turns inward, but begins to open outward, toward the vast universe in which we find ourselves. Chapter 10 opens with a truth that is both cold and liberating. The human being is not at the center. Not the center of the universe. Not the center of time. Not the absolute reference point of all meaning. From an astronomical perspective, we are only a tiny speck on a planet orbiting an ordinary star in a galaxy that is nothing special. And when we first face this truth, the ego often responds with fear. If I am not at the center, does my life become meaningless? Carl Jung understood this reaction deeply. He knew that the ego always needs a sense of being special in order to survive. But Jung did not see the loss of humanity's central position as a psychological catastrophe. He saw it as a necessary step in the maturation of consciousness. The human being is not at the center. That is true, but that does not mean life is without meaning. Jung saw the human being as a point of intersection, not the pinnacle of the universe, but the place where two dimensions meet. matter and consciousness, the finite and the infinite, nature and symbol. We do not control the universe, but the universe enters us through experience, through images, through questions that exceed our ability to answer. And it is precisely there that the human being holds an irreplaceable role. Jung once wrote, "Man is indispensable for the completion of creation." This line does not glorify the ego. It does not claim that humanity rules the universe. It says that the universe becomes conscious of itself through the human being. Not because humans are grand, but because humans can experience, contemplate, and question. The universe may exist for billions of years without us, but awareness of the universe appears only when there is a subject who can look up. At this level, when a person truly senses the scale of the cosmos, a paradox occurs. Instead of shrinking in smallness, the soul expands. When we no longer have to strain to be the center, a burden falls away. We do not need to be everything. We do not need to control everything. We are allowed to be a part, but a part with depth. Jung understood that much modern suffering comes from the inflation of the ego. We carry immense expectations to succeed, to leave a mark, to be significant in a grand way. But when we place our lives against the measure of the universe, those pressures begin to lose their absolute power, not because they become meaningless, but because they become relative. Jung once wrote with great subtlety, "The small and limited world of the ego is surpassed by the infinite world of the self. The ego contracts when it sees its own smallness, but the self, the wholeness at the center of the psyche, expands when it touches the infinite." When a person no longer identifies themselves as the center, they begin to live in a more fitting relationship with life, not inflating themselves, not denying themselves, simply standing in the right place. This is where humility appears, not as self-deprecation, but as a form of mature consciousness. Humility, in Jung's view, is not thinking oneself worthless. It is knowing precisely what one is and what one is not. It is knowing that we are finite, yet our experience touches the infinite. It is knowing that our lives are small, but not empty. In Chapter 10, the human being learns how to stand within the universe without dissolving. We do not need to project our meaning onto the entire world. We also do not need to retreat into nothingness. We stand at the boundary, where matter becomes experience, where experience becomes symbol, where symbol opens into meaning. Jung once wrote, "In the last analysis, the essential thing is the life of the individual. Not because the individual is more important than the universe, but because meaning can only arise within a life that is lived. The universe has infinite scale, but only within a finite human life does the question of meaning carry weight. And it is precisely the tension between these two poles that creates the depth of the human experience. If, as you listen now, you feel yourself becoming smaller, but not sad, that is a sign of a healthy inner adjustment. You are not disappearing. You simply no longer have to strain to be the center. And in that lightness, the soul gains more space to breathe. Chapter 10 does not teach us how to become great. It teaches us how to stand in the right place. And when night falls, when the sky opens in silence, when consciousness no longer tries to occupy the universe with understanding, sleep arrives like a gentle attunement, where the human being is allowed to be a very small, yet vividly alive, part of a vast whole. Not meaningless, not central, simply present in the right place, and therefore deeper than ever before. And when the human being has learned to stand in their proper place within the universe, neither inflated nor erased, another awareness slowly emerges. We do not exist alone, but always within a web of relationships that extends far beyond the reach of the ego. Chapter 11 opens with the dissolution of a familiar illusion, the illusion that the world runs along simple, straight lines, where causes lead to effects clearly and immediately. Human beings like to believe this because straight lines create a sense of control. We do A, we receive B. We choose correctly, we are rewarded. We choose wrongly, we are punished. But Jung understood that neither psychological life nor the outer world operates this way. They operate through networks, entangled, non-linear, and often revealing their consequences only after a long passage of time. Small actions travel farther than we imagine, not because they are large, but because they touch the system. An unconscious remark can awaken an old memory in another person. A decision that seems purely personal can alter the direction of an entire relationship, a family, even a generation. Jung did not see the world as a chain of isolated events, but as a continuous field of psychological interaction, where each individual is both cause and consequence. He once wrote, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent." This line is not only about families, it speaks to the ripple effect of what remains unconscious. The parts of us that are not lived, not seen, do not disappear. They enter the system, through behavior, through atmosphere, through repeating patterns. And then we are surprised when the world seems to betray us, when in truth, it is only responding to what has been sown into the shared network. At this level, many people fear that personal responsibility dissolves within the complexity of the system. If everything is interconnected, if consequences travel far beyond intention, does the individual still bear responsibility? Jung answered this in a way very different from traditional morality. He did not say responsibility disappears. He said responsibility becomes more subtle. Responsibility is no longer about controlling outcomes, which is impossible in a complex system. Responsibility is awareness of one's place within the network. It is knowing that every action, every attitude, every inner choice creates a wave, even if we never see the full path it takes. Jung once wrote, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it." Acceptance, in this context, is not resignation. It is the acknowledgement that we are participating in a whole larger than the ego. And when we become conscious of this, our actions naturally begin to change. Not from fear of punishment, but from a felt sense of deep relatedness between ourselves and the world. Order and chaos, in Jung's view, are not opposing extremes that cancel each other out. They are two faces of the same process. Chaos appears when elements that have not yet been integrated collide. Order appears when those elements find a new relationship. And in the process of individuation, the human being continually oscillates between these two states, both within and without. Jung once wrote, "In all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder, a secret order." This line is not meant to reassure us that everything will turn out the way we hope. It reminds us that order does not always reveal itself immediately. In a living system, order often emerges from chaos itself, when old connections no longer fit and new connections are being tested. In Chapter 11, the human being begins to realize that they are not separate from the whole, yet not dissolved within it either. We are a node, a crossing point, where larger currents pass through and are transformed. This is both humbling and empowering. Humbling, because we do not control the entire system. Empowering, because the way we show up within it still makes a difference. Jung did not call on people to become heroes who save the world. He called on them to live consciously within their own sphere. Because in a network, change does not need to be large to have an effect. It only needs to be in the right place. A single individual who dares to live honestly with their own unconscious can interrupt a chain of repetition that has lasted for generations. If, as you listen now, you feel yourself becoming both smaller and wider at the same time, that is a sign you are touching systemic awareness. You are no longer the center, but you are not a meaningless speck either. You are a point of influence, even if that influence is never fully within your control. Chapter 11 does not teach us how to master the world. It teaches us how to take responsibility in a world that cannot be mastered. And when night falls, when the mind stops trying to trace every cause and effect, sleep arrives as a natural regulation. There, order and chaos no longer oppose each other. They coexist. They move together, like the in-breath and the out-breath. And in that rhythm, the soul understands something very quietly. We do not stand outside the system. We live within it, and it lives through us. And when the human being realizes they are part of a vast network, neither separate nor in total control, yet always having an influence, a very different movement begins to arise. The need to conquer the world grows quiet, and the need to reconcile with oneself begins to emerge. Chapter 12 is no longer a step forward, but a turning back. Not a return to original innocence, but a return after passing through darkness, doubt, nothingness, and chaos. Here, the soul no longer longs to explain everything. It longs for wholeness. Carl Jung understood clearly that not every question is born to be answered. There are questions that, if forced into answers, wound the soul. They do not need to be solved. They need to be embraced. When human beings stop forcing light to defeat darkness, something gentle happens. The inner war comes to an end. Jung once wrote the famous line, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." But making the darkness conscious does not mean destroying it. It means allowing it to have a place within the totality of the human being. Light no longer has to strain under the weight of morality. Darkness no longer has to act in secret. When both are recognized, the energy once spent on fighting is released and becomes life. At this level, the concept of integration is no longer a psychological technique. It becomes a way of being. A person no longer asks, which part of me is right, which part is wrong. They ask, how can these parts coexist without destroying each other? Jung believed that wholeness does not come from becoming better, but from becoming more complete. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. To become yourself is not to reach an ideal version. It is the courage to accept that you are made of contradictions, weakness, strength, and parts that will never be fully understood. But when those parts are no longer driven away, they stop causing disturbance." In Chapter 12, the ego relinquishes its role as commander. It becomes a faithful steward of the self, the deeper, wider center in which opposing parts are held. Jung called this the stage at which the soul begins to live without division, not perfect, but real. The strange thing is this: when people stop trying to be perfect, they become more peaceful. Because peace does not come from resolving every contradiction, but from no longer fearing contradiction. Jung once reminded us, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. But Chapter 12 reveals the other side of that truth. After the pain of awareness, there is a deep settling, not ecstatic happiness, but the feeling of being at home within oneself. No need to prove, no need to defend. And here, sleep changes its meaning. It is no longer an escape from life. It becomes a ritual of return. When consciousness rests, the unconscious, the silent healer, continues its work of integrating what the day could not reconcile. Jung believed that many profound transformations do not happen while we are awake, but when we allow ourselves to rest. He once wrote, The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good. When people stop fearing the unconscious, stop trying to control it, it no longer needs to speak through symptoms. It begins to speak through gentle dreams, through a sense of being held, through a very quiet trust that nothing has to be finished in order to be accepted. Chapter 12 does not close with a truth. It closes with a permission. Permission to be a human being who is unfinished, yet no longer divided. Permission for light and darkness to sit together, no longer arguing over who is right. Permission for life to be lived, not explained. If, as you listen now, you feel your eyelids grow heavy, your breath deepen, that is not giving up. That is the soul feeling safe enough to rest, no longer needing to stay alert, no longer needing to search. Chapter 12 ends very softly, like a lullaby. Wholeness is not having all the answers. It is no longer fighting the questions. And when sleep comes, it does not carry you away from yourself. It carries you back to the place where consciousness can safely rest. And the unconscious, in gentle silence, continues the healing work it began, long before you ever learned to name it. Epilogue: returning in silence. This journey was not created for you to understand everything. It was created for you to feel safe enough to let go. From the first shadows of illusion, through the forming ego, choices heavy with responsibility, constrained freedom, existential anxiety, nothingness, doubt, ambiguity, expanding awareness, your small place in the universe, and the network of order and chaos. None of these are steps to climb. They are spirals, leading you deeper into yourself. Carl Jung never promised human beings an easy life. He only suggested a deeper possibility, a whole life. Wholeness does not mean the absence of suffering. Wholeness means suffering is no longer rejected. No part of you has to live in secret in the dark. No part of you has to strain to prove that it is right. If there is one thing you carry with you after this video, let it not be a new philosophy, but a slower breath. A very gentle sense that you do not have to complete yourself right now. Because the process of individuation, as Jung emphasized, has no finish line. It only has returns that are deeper, more honest, and more compassionate toward yourself. And now, when every question has been set down, when consciousness has gone far enough to no longer need control, you are allowed to do the simplest, and also the deepest thing: rest. Not to escape life, but to allow the unconscious to continue its healing work, quietly, patiently, without your intervention. Let sleep come as a return to the body, a return to the breath, a return to a human being who is not perfect, yet no longer divided. And if tomorrow you wake up without any new answers, that does not mean this journey was in vain. Perhaps, somewhere very deep, a part of you has stopped fighting. And sometimes, that is the most complete form of healing there is.